Peter, I turn to you. You've been covering the story every single step of the way. What was your takeaway from the news conference tonight?
Well, look, if you talk to Democrats afterwards, what you hear from a lot of them is a little bit of a relief, that he did, in fact, do badly. In fact, some of them thought he did pretty well, that he demonstrated a grasp of policy issues. He talked pretty fluently on foreign policy, especially, and that he didn't do anything anywhere near as disastrous as that debate in this big, unscripted, on-screen moment. That didn't mean he had a completely perfect performance. Obviously, when the most embarrassing one is when he said Vice President Trump when he met Vice President Harris. That was already spliced into videos and flying across the internet before the end of the news conference and provoking mockery from his opponent. And I think that's the real dilemma for President Biden right now. He can say everything right. If he makes one mistake, it's going to be magnified. And any benefit of the doubt he had before the debate is gone at this point. The microscope has been turned up to high.
Can you think of the last time President Trump, you've covered him all these years, you've written a book on him, Peter, has spoken that extensively, not on politics, but on policy, like we heard from Biden tonight?
No, President Trump is not a policy maven by any stretch. And when he does speak, obviously, it's important to remember that he himself has his own verbal gaffes and miscues. He's confused Nikki Haley with Nancy Pelosi. He often has a hard time kind of finishing a sentence with a subject and a verb and an object. So it's not that President Trump doesn't also have his own issues. I think he tends to get by them a little bit more than President Biden has because of volume, right? He speaks loudly with energy, and people take that to mean that he is in better shape, and President Biden has a little more of a frail appearance that encourages the idea that he is older. Of course, there's only 3 years difference between them, but the onus right now is on President Biden because of that debate. People are looking to see, can he handle it? Democrats want to know, can he beat Trump in the fall?
John, I mentioned it before. Congressman Jim Himes of Connecticut is now one of 17 Democratic lawmakers calling on the president to step aside. Of course, we should note the overwhelming majority of Democrats have not done so. But I want to share a bit of what he said to our colleague Alex Wagner earlier tonight.
It's really not about tonight. And one of the really kind of sick aspects of this moment is that we are watching every speech, every rally, every debate and saying, how did he do today? And that's just not the way to think about the presidency of the United States. The hard reality is, and I'm far from the only Democrat who believes this, that the numbers, the trajectory, what Americans feel in their bones right now suggest not only that Joe Biden would lose this race, but that he or we would lose the Senate and the House. And the stakes are so high that we need to set aside that loyalty and that poetry and that romance and the charge of the Light Brigade, and we all go down together in favor of some really hard-nosed analysis about whether this is the way forward.
John, what else are you hearing from Capitol Hill tonight? Because when we say hard-nosed analysis, it's funny, right after the press conference, you keep hearing, did it move the needle? What happened? We don't know if it moved the needle. It just happened.
I think the vast majority of Americans on a Thursday night weren't watching the president's press conference following a NATO summit, to be honest with you, Stephanie. But in terms of Capitol Hill, it is important. There were a few people that came out after the press conference to say that they wanted Joe Biden to step aside. I think it's 17 lawmakers that have said that now. The group that feels that way is larger than that 17. Most reporters know members of Congress who have expressed privately that desire. But the Democratic Party is torn, and it's not necessarily people who want him to go versus people who don't want him to go. There are Democratic members of Congress, there are Democratic voters, Democratic donors who go kind of back and forth on it, who aren't sure. I talked to one major Democratic donor tonight who said, that he thought that it was overwhelmingly positive tonight. He thinks Biden should step aside, but what he said is, the Democratic Party is paralyzed right now because what they saw tonight was good enough. That is helpful to Biden in terms of his desire to stay where he is. He can, for the time being, he's held off the flow of people calling him for him to step aside. We'll see if that changes. But the farther this goes along, the less time there is for another candidate to get in there and to really get going. And, that's part of the fight that's going on right now. We heard Nancy Pelosi this week, the former Speaker of the House. Biden had said that he was going to stick in. He'd made his decision, and she kept saying, let me know when you decide. She's opening the door. I think a lot of members were waiting to see what happened in this press conference, and even a member like Himes, who put out his release right at the end of the press conference, I think was trying to show the president respect during this international conference by holding back. But we'll just have to see, Stephanie. The Democratic Party is still torn over this.
Jeff, you were at that news conference. You had the first question. We are going to share it because it was a tough moment for the president. Let's watch.
What concerns do you have about Vice President Harris's ability to beat Donald Trump if she were at the top of the ticket?
Look, I wouldn't have picked Vice President Trump to be vice president because I think she was not qualified to be president. So let's start there. Number one. The fact is that the consideration is that I think I'm the most qualified person to run for president. I beat him once, and I will beat him again. Secondly, the idea, I served in the Senate a long time. The idea that senators and congressmen running for office worry about the ticket is not unusual.
Yes, that was a tough moment, but it was a moment before the next 50 minutes of policy talk. What was your take on how the news conference went overall for him?
I think that's spot on the way you just said that, Steph. I mean, it didn't start off brilliantly because of that mistake. And that was the second time today that he'd made a major mistake in terms of a name flub. I was in the room earlier in the night when he started to introduce President Zelensky and referred to him as Putin. Another really big mistake. That one he corrected right away. This one he didn't. I don't think he realized he'd made it. But then he went on, as you said, in the rest of the press conference to talk policy, to talk politics, to banter a little bit, to show some humor, to take on Trump, certainly much more directly than he did on the night of the debate. So a lot of wins for President Biden, but also a handful of missteps. And the problem for him politically is that some people won't have seen the whole press conference. And some people, even if they have, will only remember those flubs. And that's just a reality of where we are in 2024 and with the social media landscape and with GIFs and everything else. That's something that will stick with them. So that's a hurdle that he's going to have to keep going over and over the next coming weeks and months.
Carol, what are you hearing tonight? What was your takeaway?
I think that everyone on the panel did a great job of summarizing what happened and what we saw. But what I saw was a man who's slightly frail, slightly feeble, struggles to get from one sentence to the next. And it is what I am hearing the most from Democrats. Their fear, and donors, their fear that the polls show a certain trajectory and it's not going to change whether they have a good enough night or a disastrous night with Joe Biden. The anxiety that Senator Bennett, for example, referenced, that we are on a trajectory, in his view, for the entire Democratic Party to be taken down by Donald Trump, the House and the Senate to go Republican, and for Trump to win by a landslide. Those are the things that Democrats are focused on. Yes, they're clutching their pearls or holding their breath for every one of these events. But privately, they are saying that they are pleading with Pelosi, Schumer, and Jeffries to speak to Biden and explain to him how to graciously exit. That's the communication that people are having, because they may say, great, he did a good enough job. But keep in mind, Steph, Donald Trump's camp tonight is celebrating that he did a good enough job. They're hoping that Joe Biden stays on the ticket because they feel that that is their best possible chance of a very serious and resounding victory.
Later, we're going to talk about what Donald Trump was doing tonight, and that was alarming in its own right. Peter, you and your colleagues at the New York Times have been reporting on how some of the president's advisors may try to persuade him to step aside. The White House has denied this report, but fill us in on what you know and what we need to know.
Yeah, look, there's a lot of people inside President Biden's campaign and administration who do not believe this is survivable, who think that they do need to find a way to transition to a different candidate. And they're not sure how to convince him of that. They haven't had this conversation with him as far as we can tell, but a number of them have talked with each other about the best way to approach it. And one way that they think that needs to happen is to convince him, first of all, that he can't win, or that it's so unlikely that he'll win that he ought not to stay in the race. Secondly, they need to convince him, they believe, that somebody else can win. It's not just enough to say, well, you're doing badly. They have to be able to convince him that perhaps somebody like Kamala Harris can, in fact, win. And thirdly, they're talking about whether or not they can manage a transition like this smoothly without the kind of chaos that he doesn't want to see. So that's what the conversation is happening right now inside those circles. Again, whether they take that to the president or not, it's still an open question, and just as it is with these congressional leaders.
Hey there, MSNBC fans. I'm Luke Russert, and be sure to join me, Rachel Maddow, Jen Psaki, Lawrence O'Donnell, Steve Kornacki, Joy Reid, and many more September 7th in Brooklyn, MSNBC Live Democracy 2024. Click on the link for ticket information. We will see you there.